Welcome to those people who are just beginning to attend this webinar today. I'm Marcia Meskeman. As soon as we get this going, I'll introduce it, but we're delighted that everyone's able to be here. Thank you very much for taking the time. Welcome to participants who are still coming in. We're still being joined. I'm going to give people one more minute and then we're going to go so that we're on time. Okay. So welcome. My name is Marcia Meskeman. I'm the director of the Institute of Advanced Studies here at Loughborough University. And it's very much my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar today on heritage and debt. We are thrilled by having an absolutely amazing range of speakers and interlocutors today around this topic. But also I want to give you just a little bit of information. If you've not attended a Zoom webinar before, you will find that there are both chats and Q&As. So if you really want to ask a very specific and focused question at any point, please try to put that into the Q&A. The chat is more for exactly what it says, for chatting, so commentary and running discussion. But colleagues will be looking at this and making sure that there are sort of answers and so forth. And there is the potential to answer offline to some of the questions, or indeed answer after the webinar and have that feedback. So please feel free to ask direct questions, but also to have conversation through those fora. And if you get confused and you start asking questions in the chat, we'll all live with that. So don't be alarmed. It's just that I'm obliged to tell you that there are different formats for these sorts of things. We are thrilled today to be welcoming colleagues, and I'm going to be handing over very shortly to my colleague Kathryn Brown, who is not only my colleague in a literal sense here at Loughborough, but is the convener of today's event on heritage and debt. And I am thrilled that Kathryn has been able to put this together and have such an interesting forum, and she will talk about the nature of the forum and how it's going to run today. But critically, Kathryn is a senior lecturer in art history and visual culture here at Loughborough University, but also the convener of our museums and markets group. And so this is really up her street, and I'm quite thrilled to have that happening today. The IAS is a relatively new institute at the university, and we have been formed for 4 years. And our remit really is to bring together international and interdisciplinary conversations on issues of kind of key import, and to enable collaborations to happen across boundaries, both disciplinary and national, for scholars in Loughborough. And one of the things we've been looking at doing through a series of events and themes over the course of the last 4 years is precisely to ask key critical questions, pressing questions of importance to the world, and the way in which research can actually have something to do with that. And so I am really delighted that we're going to have a conversation today about David Joselit's really exciting book on heritage and debt, and to have really interested and kind of stellar participants doing critical interlocution with this, because these are key issues for the day. We live in a world where we talk all the time in commonplace language about a notion of a heritage industry and what that might mean. We talk about world heritage while we live in a world that is marked absolutely by asymmetries of global power, and particularly economic distribution and power. We live in a world where we have to talk about heritage and restitution, and we should be thinking much more seriously about the nature of restitution in relation to that. But also a global art market. And again, something we speak of in blithe terms, but is actually something quite difficult and powerful, and something worth discussing. So today's conversation will be yet another intervention, I'm hoping, and open discussion on an area that is really critical to all of us and to thinking about in terms of looking at the power politics of the world and the way in which the arts actually intersect with that. And with that said, I really want to turn over to my colleague Kathryn now, who will introduce what we're doing today. Welcome to the virtual IAS, and have a very good afternoon.
Thank you so much, Marcia. And thank you to Loughborough's Institute for Advanced Studies, to Marcia, to the team who've supported this event. And if I could also mention Kieran Teasdale and Bhavna Patel, who have been absolutely wonderful in helping us to organize this. I'd also very much like to thank our speakers. Thank you, David Joselit, for being with us today. Thank you for our discussants for coming along. This event has had to be moved a couple of times because of the pandemic. So it's absolutely terrific that we've actually managed to bring it off. And I'm really delighted to have you all here, some in person, some virtually. As Marcia said, we're here to talk about heritage and debt. So a book that David Joselit published in 2020 with MIT Press. And it deals with urgent issues that are confronting museums and indeed the way in which we write histories of European modernism. One of the things that I'm looking forward to talking about is what we actually think of as global contemporary art, what it can achieve both practically and conceptually, and as Marcia mentioned, how it circulates through global networks of financial and cultural exchange. Now, I'm going to invite David in a second to give a brief introduction to the book. Then we're going to hear from two of the discussants and have a bit of debate. We'll have a short break and then we'll hear from three more discussants. And then there'll be an opportunity for open discussion, including questions from our online audience. So as Marcia said, please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we will be, oh, sorry, I got that wrong, in the Q&A, and we'll be happy to raise them. Now, I'd like to introduce our first three speakers. So first of all, David Joselit is Professor and Chair of Art, Film and Visual Studies at Harvard. He's written many influential books and articles, and I just want to mention a few of them. There's Infinite Regress, Marcel Duchamp, 1910 to 1941, American Art since 1945, and then Feedback, Television Against Democracy, and in 2012, After Art. In addition to organizing numerous art exhibitions, David is also the editor of the journal October, and he writes regularly, I'm sure you'll know, on contemporary art and culture. And so it's terrific to have an opportunity to speak about his most recent book. We're joined in our first session by Faisal Devji, who is Professor of Indian History at St. Antony's College at the University of Oxford. He's published widely on the intellectual history and political thought of modern South Asia, as well as on the emergence of Islam as a global category. He's the author of several books, including most recently Muslim Zion, Pakistan as a Political Idea, and The Impossible India, Gandhi and the Temptation of Violence. Luke Skrebowski is also joining us in this first session. He's a lecturer in contemporary art at the University of Manchester, and his research focuses on the history and theory of late 20th and 21st century art in the UK, Europe, the USA, and Brazil. He specializes in post-conceptual contemporary art and its historical genealogy. He's written numerous articles on these themes, and he's also the co-editor of Aesthetics and Contemporary Art and is completing a book entitled Contesting Conceptual Art, Systems, Aesthetics and Politics. So first of all, I'd like to invite David to give us just a brief introduction to heritage and debt to set us up, and then we'll hand straight over to Faisal and then to Luke. So David, over to you.
Thanks, Kathryn, and thank you so much for sticking with this project over, I don't know how, has it been 2 years since, since the original idea, and everyone at the Institute of Advanced Studies. I'm sorry I couldn't come in person, but it's a real privilege to share this book with such an amazing group of discussants. So thank you for your attention to my book. I really appreciate it. So I am going to be very brief and just bring up 3 points that I feel were important to me in doing this book and that I hope communicate through it. The first is that my ambition was to write a book about globalization with art as its archive, as opposed to a book specifically on what could be called global contemporary art, which is such a vexed category. And I'm sure we'll have a lot to say about that this morning. But what I really wanted to think about or to demonstrate as best I could in my work is that the realm of art is not merely a kind of representation or reflection of global mechanisms, but in fact, a site of very powerful conditions of globalization. And there are a number of ways in which that becomes true. One that interests me a lot that I wasn't able to really explore so much in the book itself is how contemporary art becomes important in locations that are transitioning from extractive or manufacturing economies to knowledge economies. And the rise of contemporary art in those places, or art infrastructure, seems to be a way of signaling a kind of economic transformation. But at the core of the book are these vexed terms, especially the vexed term, as Marcia laid out, of heritage, which I define as any kind of resource or inheritance culturally, as opposed to debt. And here's where a kind of global dynamic that is very much involved in the circulation of art, including questions of restitution, is really important, because it seemed to me that in a neoliberal world where governance by debt is a kind of primary function of globalization, that heritage in a sense allows for a kind of counter resource, a form of cultural property that can cause real investment and symbolic investment across asymmetrical situations in terms of debt. It was also important to me that the use of heritage as a kind of resource would be just as valid or present in contemporary art from the West as it is from the global South, or whatever vexed term we want to use. The East, the non-West, none of them is really adequate. But so one thing that was important to me was this sense of harnessing a certain kind of cultural specificity or particularity within a kind of global language, a lingua franca, as it were, of contemporary art, was just as true in New York, say, as it would be in Shanghai or in Buenos Aires. So along these lines, I think we can think of a number of artists in Europe and the United States who have been looking back to various forms of heritage, including modernist heritage. So the first point then is that I hope that this book is a book about globalization with art as its archive, as opposed to a kind of survey of global. It certainly is not an adequate survey. I mean, anyone would know that after a minute. I mean, it's a selective, strange problem to kind of choose one's archive for a project that promises such a broad scope. Okay, so the second thing that I believe firmly in every context, but that was particularly important in this one, is that you can't really understand contemporary art without engaging in the history of modernism and in the kind of different genealogies of modern experience and modern expression that developed throughout the world, let's say since the 18th century, or whatever kind of term you want to use. The thing about this question of a plurality or a spectrum of modernisms is that what's very important here is that the chronologies are really different. They don't necessarily synchronize with one another. But what I argue in the book is that 4 different genealogies of modernism are synchronized through globalization in the 80s and 90s. And these include a post-colonial model, a socialist realist model, an underground model, as well as the Euro-American avant-garde, let's say, or Western modern and contemporary art. The post-colonial, I'll say a phrase about each of these because I really don't want to speak for too long. So the post-colonial, of course, I'm indebted to a number of important figures in all of the archives that I'm using in this book. I could never have written this book without the amazing work that has been done across the world in excavating histories of art outside Europe and the United States and North America. So the post-colonial is one where a kind of indigenous traditions are suppressed alongside the suppression of modernist art training. So there's a kind of double bind where indigenous artists are neither are prevented from having access to a kind of heritage, let's say, a continuous heritage, while also being prevented from practicing as modern artists. And so the recovery of a kind of heritage, let's say, becomes an important political move, as does the kind of harnessing of realism. The socialist realist model, which is associated with the kind of second world, as it were, is one in which modernity, I argue, has more to do with producing a mass culture through model painting, through the use of painting as a kind of provocation to creating a modern public sphere, as opposed to painting as a kind of valuable private form of property. The underground model pertains to areas such as much of Latin America and Eastern Europe, where there was a strong European modernist tradition that for one reason or another was diverted through the foreclosure of public spheres through various forms of authoritarian government. So, and then the Western avant-garde is the fourth of these genealogies. It seems to me that without understanding how they come together in the 80s and 90s and sort of misrecognize one another, as it were, really we're left with a form of globalization that is really flattened, that is truly a kind of world of the biennial, that it's very important for these histories to be understood, and also to understand how they're lost to some degree through in the advent of a kind of globalization. And so for me, this is maybe, you know, it's funny because I wrote this book now a long time and I've written a short postscript to it since then. So in some ways my thinking has changed a lot. And I think that one of the most important things for me is this introduction of history into our thinking about contemporary art. I think it's kind of crucial, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk about that. Then the third point I want to make is really more a kind of I guess one could say a kind of aesthetic point. And that is that I wanted to offer an account of the ready-made as a modern and contemporary device that changes over time, but has become almost entirely ubiquitous, especially in the kind of archives that I identified as global contemporary art. First of all, I made an analogy between the ready-made practice and photography. I mean, photography, you know, began as a kind of, well, I suppose one could say a novelty, and moved through various phases where it was used as a tool, and it became an art, or it was considered as an art through, you know, very kind of purposeful efforts. And now it's basically a tool that's used by almost every artist one way or another. And I would like to kind of think of the ready-made as one of those modern devices, let's say, procedures, that has more or less saturated virtually every contemporary art practice. I mean, certainly not everyone, but it's become, you know, really almost ubiquitous. And so what I want to argue in the course of this book is that the ready-made becomes a particularly helpful strategy within a global context, because it's possible to make contradictory claims on the self-same object. So if you have, let's say, a ready-made object from Colombia or from China, there can be claims made on that object from a national context from which it comes, ostensibly, and then claims made on it from an audience that is projecting, you know, their ideas of Latin Americanness or their ideas of Chineseness onto this work. And so this is where the ready-made becomes a kind of interesting screen of projection for various kinds of global claims and fantasies, because the very same thing means something different. Clearly must be understood as the same thing in that it was appropriated, but its meaning is quite different in terms of how it circulates from one context to another. And so it seems to me that this is related, but quite different from the Duchampian move of kind of challenging the categories of art. I think what we see in contemporary forms of the ready-made is challenges within the realm of heritage, let's just say. So that helps to maybe tie the bow that Kathryn suggested in her introduction. My first academic work was on Duchamp, and in some ways, I've tried throughout my career to understand the strategy of the ready-made as one that transforms and affects contemporary art, and has done since its invention, I guess, just over 100 years ago. So with that, again, my deep thanks for your attention to this work. It really is very gratifying to me, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, David.